Have you ever wondered what is a service worker or how to integrate the Cache API into the browser? Hey hackers, I'm Jorge Ferreiro, front-end software engineer at Eventbrite. In this video, I'm sharing you the webinar that I did recently for Codemotion. In the webinar, I'm explaining you what is a progressive web application from the motivation to building your first progressive web application from scratch. So subscribe for more videos like this one, thumbs up, and see you in the comments.
Okay, just in time for showing away. Welcome to a new webinar from Codemotion. In this case, Jorge Ferreiro will be speaking about progressive web apps. I think that he has a lot of questions for you, audience, so I hope that this webinar will be more interactive, a lot of participation from the audience, and I will leave you with Jorge and the presentation and his questions, basically.
All right. So, hi everybody. So I would like to start with two questions. Since this is kind of like a webinar format, it's kind of complicated to answer, but just let me know in the chat. So the first one is like, how many of you actually have ever created a web application? I could assume that most of you, but the second one is basically, how many of you know what a progressive web app is? So maybe less people answer this app. So I'm Jorge Ferreiro. I'm a front-end software engineer at Eventbrite. Previously, I was working at Amazon. I'm a blogger, DJ, a fan of musicals. And also I have like a YouTube show where I interview people. So just search for my name and you will find it. So that's kind of the introduction, but what are we gonna actually build today? So it's a workshop, so I would like to share lots of code, lots of stuff. So this is gonna be our first progressive web application. So we are gonna build some sort of like an agenda, like an application to display an agenda of an event. And we will cover like offline mode, local notifications, cache requests, payments API. And we will not, like this application will not have background sync or IndexedDB. So demo time. So I recorded a video because, you know, like demos are demos. But basically, this is the application. So it shows a list of the different events. You can mark as a favorite. You can receive notification when that event happens, as well as you can reserve a seat directly with the payments API. Another really cool stuff is that this application also works offline, which means now, as we can see in the video, if I go offline and I refresh the page, bam, the application keeps working. For me, it's one of the things that I'm most excited about progressive web apps. So for those of you that are interested, you can find the source code in my GitHub. So just search for Ferreiro and then PWA 101 and you will find it. So the agenda for today, I always like to start with the motivation, like why are we talking about progressive web apps, why I'm so excited, and what other companies in the industry are using progressive web apps successfully. And then we will go through different steps on how to create your first progressive web application. We will cover the manifest, service workers, as well as offline mode and APIs. And I will just give some advanced topics that you can research later on. So this audience is kind of tricky just because like there are a lot of people with lots of web development experience, as well as other people that are kind of new or started to work more often. So I would like to cover the whole range. So for those of you that are beginners, I feel like this talk will basically give you like some sort of an idea of what a progressive web app is and some intuitions on how can you actually start using it. For those of you that have web development experience, but maybe not experience with PWA, I feel that this workshop will literally give you code ideas that you can copy, paste, play around with that, and build your first PWA. And for those of you that are experts on PWA, which I know that some of you are, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but maybe this is not the right workshop for you. But at least, or hopefully, you will learn a different perspective on how I define PWAs. So as Fran mentioned before, Fran will help me out with all the questions. So if you have questions out on the workshop, just let me know that you type them on the chat, or you can also type in through Twitter. So Fran, please keep an eye to Twitter as well with the hashtag CodemotionPWA. And at the end, I will allocate like 5 to 10 minutes to answer those questions. So we have 1 hour, so pretty intense and pretty busy 1 hour. So this is gonna be basically the hashtag CodemotionPWA. It's gonna be down below in every slide, so you can type it, and then that's my Twitter. As I always like to say, sharing is caring. So if you like the talk, if you find something interesting, I would really appreciate if you can share with us. If you find something that you don't like, just also let us know. So let's get started. What are PWAs? So it's kind of tricky, and many people have different definitions, but this is my own one. So for me, it's basically a web application that can adapt the user experience to different things. And what are those things? The device that the user has, the network request, and user needs. So basically, it covers a whole variety of things. It's basically building an application that can adapt to many different circumstances. For me, the big selling point of PWAs is also that they can bring native app functionalities into web applications. You know, like it's cool stuff like offline mode or push notifications, but in a web application. I feel like that's super awesome. And for me, it's something that excites me a lot. So for me, it's like, wow, that's cool. So for me, there is a concept that is really important and is really key when we are talking about PWAs, which is progressive enhancement. And for me, it's a really hard word to pronounce anyway. So basically, the idea when we are building PWAs is I will not wait till all the user upgrade to the latest browser version. I will not wait if there are users that already use Internet Explorer 11. Basically, the idea is I'm going to use the latest available features that the user has in their phone, in their desktop, in their computer, and I'm going to use them in my PWA. So a more kind of like intuition about that is basically your PWA, your progressive web application, it's going to be different, or it's going to mutate depending on the user and what the user has. So some users will see a very empty and not so cool cake, but other users actually will see a super amazing cake with candles, with cream, and really amazing, right? So that's kind of the intuition behind that. I'm going to give you an example of progressive enhancement. So when I was very young, I suffered to not have a very great internet connection, and my phone was really crappy. So I kind of suffered this. But nowadays, like most of us, we don't experience like bad internet connection, or we don't have really crappy phones. We have like cool phones with lots of powers. But that's not really the reality out there in many other places. So let's put an example in Africa. Sometimes they don't have that great internet connection. They may have cheap phones. Some other people will have really great phones. But imagine those people with really bad phones. So we can offer them a simplified web version. We can offer them like a data save mode, like don't downloading images, don't downloading videos if the connection is really bad, as well as limit access to advanced features. So for those people, we will offer, coming back to the analogy of the cake, a very simple version of our application. However, what happens if we are in United States and we have like a super high quality phones, 5G internet connection? The story is going to be slightly different. So we will basically offer, yeah, high quality media. We will offer then advanced features like push notifications, background scene, and we will do more stuff. So that kind of summarizes the idea of progressive enhancement. It's basically thinking, how can I adapt the user experience on my application to different devices, different user needs, as well as different like network connections. This is a very simplification. Obviously, this doesn't exist, but the idea behind the progressive enhancement is a bunch of if-else conditionals. If this feature, if push notification is available in the user browser, let's use that. Otherwise, all right, so that user will not have push notifications. And then like to finish this part about like what is a progressive web app, basically I would like to give like some PWA features that Aslak Rachel and Jake Archival, which are two people that works for Google, created when they come up with this term about progressive web applications. So what are the features behind a PWA? The first one is responsive. We need to make sure like our application adapts to different browsers, as well as, you know, like have a responsive design. The second one, really important, is works offline. If we said before, well, I mean, we can bring like native app functionalities. If our application doesn't work, if I don't have internet connection, that's not really cool. So a PWA can also work offline. More about this later. Then like we will try to kind of emulate the app-like interactions, like the native app functionalities, right? So basically, you know, we will try to emulate, depending on the ecosystem, how those applications work. Fresh. Imagine how many times, if you have developed like Android application or iOS applications, there is a big pain of basically making sure that your users upgrade to higher versions of your application. The thing that in PWAs, the story is slightly different. So you can actually push updates very easily. Is basically anytime that the user connects to your application and gets, for example, connects to the server, you will check and say, hey, I have a new version of the application, and the user will download. So actually it's very transparent, and you're making sure like you can deliver the latest versions to your users. Then, in the other hand, the PWAs should be safe. So you will find that I would say most or all of the functionalities and features that we will build today requires a very secure internet connection, requires that you basically set up a server with SSL security layers. So that's basically because we are working with very complicated data. Like if you're working with payments, if you are sending push notifications, you want to make sure like nobody's out there messing around and sending wrong things to our users. So that's why it's really important to also be a very safe application. That's one of the tricky parts about a PWAs when you work for the first time, which is about like how I set up all the server and make sure like everything is up and running and you deal with the certificates. Fortunately, the PWA application that I created today already has that. So you just need to fork and use that. The other part is discoverable. Basically, you know, a PWA in essence is a web application. So basically that will be indexable by Google in the search engines. Then re-engageable. Basically, like one of the pain points when you're building a web application is how can I make sure that our users are coming back to the application? You know, if you're using Instagram, you're always like seeing lots of notifications, and that's part of the business model. So with a PWA, they already have this functionality of sending push notifications. Linkable, well, at the end of the day, it's a web URL, so you can just share that link. And durable, which is what sort of mechanisms do we have to basically make sure like we can save data from the user, we can persist that information. So that's why there are things like IndexedDB, or there are things like offline mode where you cache different resources. So this is kind of like, I'm gonna drink a little bit of water. So what the Google right now has in order to upload PWAs into the marketplace is what they call trusted web activity. And there is a really cool articles out there of people saying, I built my PWA and I was able to upload to the Google marketplace. And that's incredible. That's a really great advance of basically saying, I'm building this PWA and I can deliver to other users through a new marketplace. Android rocks because like it tends to have the latest functionalities. It supports most of the PWA's functionalities. However, iOS is not like that. It's taking their time. Apparently, they prefer more native applications because that's part of the business model. So they kind of like don't really like PWAs that much. Anyway, so right now, I would like to talk to you about like different PWAs in the industry. So what other top leaders and other companies are actually building. So there are really great examples. So Pinterest, Twitter, Tinder, and Starbucks. they all have really great PWAs applications. I especially love Twitter. It feels to me that Twitter is always like investing a lot of money and be kind of like the leaders on PWAs. So let me share some data. I'm sure numbers. I know like we are all geeks, so we don't really love, like lots of business stuff, but these numbers are really great to showcase the power and how really awesome are PWAs for your business as well as for your company. So in the case of Pinterest, when they released the new mobile web with PWAs functionality, they increased by 843% new sign-ups year per year. That's a lot of new users. Twitter decreased by 70% the data consumption of the application, thanks to different like strategies to basically making sure like they can deliver more smart all the resources. And Tinder, how many of you use Tinder? Tinder basically decreased from 11.37 seconds to 4.69 seconds to download. So that's really awesome. Like the loading time was like faster. And at the end of the day, that means like the user are happier, they can interact faster with the application, and that's a huge benefit for them. I give you here a website which is called Apps Code, where it's really cool. It's kind of like a marketplace with different PWAs, so you can go there, get inspiration, and see what other people in the industry are actually doing. And this is the third point to finish with this kind of context part before I start to code, which is why progressive web applications. So I introduced what a PWA is. I introduced what other people in the companies in the industry are actually doing with the PWA ecosystem, but why PWA? So for me, why just why? So first of all, it's an adaptive experience. That's really powerful. We start to think just not only about 5G connection with really top phones, but also we start to think to a broad number of users. So having the ability to adapt our experience and our web application based on what the user has is really, really important and is really key. In the other hand, distribution freedom. We don't need Apple, we don't need Google to basically passing through their lots of millions of rules to accept or reject your application in their marketplaces. This is free. Like I have a web application, anybody that accesses and clicks on add to home screen will be able to install the application. Of course, if they meet the PWA criteria that I will explain later how to set your PWA manifest. Then in the third hand, offline app notification. That's really awesome. Like basically that reduces a lot the gap between native apps and web applications. That's why I may always think like, yeah, this is the future of web development, and this is kind of like the future of mobile applications just because of all these features. And in the last part is smaller and one-click install, which is really, again, like you reduce a lot of friction for that first installation of the users. So I'm gonna drink a little bit of water. And we are gonna start actually with the let's build our first PWA. All right, so as I mentioned before, we're gonna build a PWA with all these technologies. So it's in React, I'm using Yarn, Webpack, as well as Emotion for the CSS. But even though if you haven't worked with React or any of those technologies, don't worry, because what we are gonna see today is basically vanilla JavaScript. So the cool stuff is that even though the project is in React, all the code about like PWA and all these functionalities, you can copy and paste in your applications because it's just JavaScript. As I mentioned before, this is all the stuff that this application will have. We will not cover payments API, like you can go to the GitHub repository and download, but the rest of the stuff which are really critical to build a PWA, we will cover today. And then background scene and IndexedDB, it doesn't have those. So the first thing that we need in order to make to start converting our regular web application into a PWA is the progressive meta tags. I know most of you, if you have worked with responsive design, you already have those meta tags in your HTML, but this is more like a heads up, like this is really required. So the first thing is making sure like your application adapts to mobile screens. So make sure like you include this viewport with these different properties. I put there a link that is really interesting if later on you want to understand like why this viewport meta tag, like why do we really need this, and what the historical reasons because of the way Apple was rendering websites in their first versions of the iPhone. So that's a link in case you want to know why the viewport. Then the second step is theme color. So this is typically match your company brand color palette. But yeah, like, you know, if you see the navbar, basically those colors that appear there, right? So if you see Facebook, that blue color, Snapdeal, etc., etc. And Apple meta tags. So there are some meta tags require an Apple specific. Later on, you can take a look to these and revisit them. Yeah, this sucks. And then more Apple meta tags, specifically for the images. I particularly use favicongenerator.org. So it's a really great website where you drag and drop your icon, and it generates all the manifests as well as all the different icons and all the different sizes, which is really nice. And most of the time I use that, to be honest. Now let's go to the manifest. So we have the meta tags. So our website is now responsive and has some different icons, etc. Now let's basically build the manifest.json. So what is this manifest? At the end of the day, just a file where basically we tell the browser, hey, listen, these are the properties of my application. So when I mentioned before about the criteria to be a PWA, a progressive web application, you need a manifest in order to be eligible for a PWA. So again, like these are a lot of properties, so later on you can revisit, but I will focus on some of them. So the short name is basically making sure, in our case, PenApps is the name of our application. So that's going to be the text that appears just below your icon. The star URL, maybe some of you may wonder like what UTM source means. So the star URL of our application is going to be the slash, which is the main root. It's kind of like the entry point. If I go to google.com, that first homepage. But something that is really important is to add that UTM source, in our case, PWA. Why? Because basically, this will let us in the Google Analytics later on to identify how many people actually come through the mobile application, accessing through the browser or other mechanisms, and how many people actually come from the PWA application. This is really important in order to have metrics, to know what our users are coming from, as well as to measure the impact of how beneficial is to have PWA functionalities versus not having them. So with the UTM source, which comes from Arching tracking module, it will allow you to do that. At the end of the day, it's kind of like an API, like a contract, which is kind of like a standard for tracking URLs. Something interesting is the icons list. So at least you need to make sure you include these two ones. So the 512 is going to be for the splash screen. So when you open an application, you always see like that's a splash screen with the icon. So this is where you specify the icon. And then the other one, which is the 192 for the home screen icon. Something really important is the display. So basically, you can specify different values. So full screen is basically, very great for video games. You don't have any browser UI. It's just like, boom, full screen. It's same as when you are on YouTube and you put on full screen that you don't see the browser, etc. It's the same. Standalone. This is the one that is kind of like the native applications. So this is kind of like the recommendation for PWAs, except if you are building, unless if you are building a video game. And then you have the minimal UI and the browser. The browser is you go to Chrome or Safari, so that's the browser. A minimal UI is similar to the browser, but with less items. I put a link down below where you can just explore this manifest in details. Something that is really important for me is basically making sure that you can test your manifest anytime that you do changes or you're setting that for the first time. So in this case, if you go to Chrome DevTools, you will open the application tab and you will go to the manifest. And the cool stuff is that it already tells you if there are any problems. So in my case, for example, it's saying no matching service worker detected. You may need to reload the page. So that's one of the criteria to be a PWA. Then, in the other hand, we have the beautiful Lighthouse, which is a new tool for basically running different analysis on your application. So it will tell you how good is the performance, the accessibility, as well as the PWA kind of like checklist. So in my case, for example, it's telling me, hey, you're using HTTPS 1, or you're using a redirect HTTP traffic to HTTPS. So again, it all depends on your application, but it's always really great to double check what you have introduced. So now let's dive to a really cool topic, which are the service worker. So first, I'm going to explain for me what a service worker is, kind of like the high-level overview, and I'm going to put an analogy with the real world. So for me, a service worker is a client-side proxy. It's kind of like a client-side proxy. Why I'm saying that? So a proxy, because basically it will stay between the server and the client. So anytime the client sends a request, this service worker will be in the middle, will be that person in the middle saying, oh, the client wants this request, what I should do with this stuff. And then we'll handle all the responses, etc. So the cool stuff about service worker is, apart from being that person in the middle, it gives you control over the cache. More about this later on, but a very critical stuff to do offline mode, like how do we cache and save those resources, as well as how to respond to these different requests. So it gives you the full autonomy to basically decide what to do with a request. And by a request, I mean, I want the index HTML, I want this image, or simply I want to do this request to an API to get a JSON data. So it's that person in the middle that is always knowing what's going on. And also, a service worker is simply a JavaScript file that runs separately from the main browser thread. And this is really important because once you instantiate and generate that service worker, that will rely, or that will stay completely separate from the browser. And it's just basically this mechanism to communicate between browser and the service worker. Now let's write our first service worker. So first of all, we create a service worker.js. You can call it in the way you want. And basically, we will specify, we will listen to different actions or to different events. So I don't know how many of you are familiarized with the concept of a callback, but basically a callback, in this case, for example, what we are specifying in the first line is anytime that there is an event about installation, anytime that I'm installing the service worker, I want you to execute this function. That's what a callback is. When something happens, call this function back. In this case, for example, we can do some stuff like downloading the critical resources or tracking if the service worker was installed or not. And in the second example, we are listening to the fetch events. So fetch events happen when anytime that the user requests a new resource, image, HTML, JSON, etc. So in this case, for example, in this example, we are just simply logging what is the requested URL. Now that we have the service worker, we need to go to the app.js or whatever you specify your application, and we need to instantiate the service worker. So first, we will say if the user has the option to use service worker, in this case, if service worker is in navigation, in this case, we're logging a message saying, yeah, I start to register a service worker. And apart from that, we will call this navigator.serviceworker.register. And we will pass the file name of our service worker. This register function, what it's going to return is a promise. So basically, if the promise resolves successfully, we will get a registration object that later on we can manipulate or do something else. Otherwise, There's no service worker supported, so the user will not have this experience available for them. So if we execute the previous service worker, this is how it's going to look like. We are basically intercepting network requests. So something to consider here is we are requesting the main page, the root, we are requesting the CSS, the fonts, the JS files, the images, basically everything. This goes back to the idea, as I mentioned before, as a proxy, because this service worker right now is logging any single request that it receives.
Jorge, one question here. BP is asking if all the code are methods present in React.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this is not React specific. This is basically vanilla JavaScript. So if the browser supports service worker, you will be able to access to this, but it's not specific to React. It's available in the browser itself. I hope that answers the question. Otherwise, in the Q&A, I will try to explain that better. Anyway, so now let's transition to, for me, like the secret sauce of service worker, which is how can we make an offline application? So we will rely on the cache API. So we will explain why, like what is the cache API and how to use that with lots of examples. We have like 5 different examples of different strategies on how to cache resources for our application. And as I said before, this is the secret sauce, or this is the most important part, or one of the most important parts of a PWA, which is how can we, cache resources, offer an offline mode to our users. So first of all, what I mean by offline mode, anytime that you go offline, you don't have internet connection, be able to keep using the application as you were using before. Of course, if you need to fetch some resources from a server and you need to get some data, well, that will not be available as of now. But if you are in WhatsApp, you will still be able to see pictures or messages. What do we need in order to offer that offline mode? To have a mechanism to cache files, means to store those files in the browser, so they are accessible and available anytime that I reload the page without internet connection. So we are going to rely on the cache API. So basically, the cache API is a key value storage mechanism for responses pairs. And then the cool stuff about the cache API is that it gives you programmatic control over caching assets inside a service worker. And I'm putting this memo like cache all the things. Well, not all the things, but be cautious. But yeah, caching is cool. Anyway, so 7.1 cache hello world. As I mentioned before, we have this cache storage API. So it's very simple. We call caches.open, and basically that will return a promise with a cache object. Why is this important? More of this later. So the cache object basically will expose several methods like add all, put, delete, match all. So that will basically let us add a resource to the cache, delete a resource from the cache, or check if a resource is on the cache. So this will give us all the programmatic access to the cache. So as you can see, this is just more like for clarifying, but by request, it can be a request object that you create with a new request and the parameters, or directly the URL. So you can pass a string of, like index.html or a path to your image. And then in the response, basically a response could be when you call to the fetch, that's a response in this cache object world. So a very simple example, we have these event listeners as before. So this will be triggered when we install the service worker. And in the first line, we are opening the cache. So we are like saying, give me the instance of this cache. Give me the cache object. As you see, I'm passing a cache name version. This is really cool. On every new update that you do on your web application, you will specify several versions. So you can say, oh, this is the version 1 of my service worker. This is the version 2. So we need that in order to basically say, for this V1, these are all the cache resources. But in V2, these are going to be the rest of the cache resources. So that's why we need to specify the version name. Then, since this returns a promise, if we are able to create to get a cache object, we will add 2 files to the cache. So we will basically add index.html as well as the JavaScript bundle. If it fails, we will call the cache block and we will do something else. We can basically say, if those are critical resources, the service worker should not work. Or simply you can notify the user or do something else with that. Something that is really cool, I mean, when we are working with service worker, they can be tricky. So I strongly suggest you to use the application tab. So if you go directly to the DevTools, sorry. So if you go directly to the application tab and you go inside the cache part, you will see V1. And that will contain all the cache resources for the version 1 of that service worker. Again, if you submit a new version of the service worker, you will have several entries on this cache storage. And then if you click on particular files, you will be able to see the content as well as the size and other interesting metadata. Again, this is really helpful when you are debugging and you want to know what's going on. Another cool tip is basically going to the clear storage part, because it will give you an stats of what's the size of the cache and other useful information. So in this case, for example, as you can see, since I only added 2 files, the index and the JavaScript, it's taking 2.1 megabytes. So this is really helpful, you know, to control and say, well, I need to balance like how many resources do I cache and what is the total size of that. So this will give you an overview of that. Now in the 7.2, for me, there is something really important, which is caching the critical assets. So those are the assets, like if you go offline mode, you need to load in order to offer the user the same experience. So those can be, you know, it can be the index.html, the main JavaScript bundle, the main CSS, some pictures that are required, like the logo or some icons. So that's what a critical asset is. It's basically something that is really needed in order to be able to show the application to the user. There is something really important here for caching the critical assets, which is the event.waitUntil. So we will see in an example right away, but basically the waitUntil method will tell, hey, I don't want this service worker to keep moving forward from the install to the install lifecycle until I'm able to cache all the critical resources. And if I'm failing to basically downloading those critical resources, I will not execute this service worker. It's dead. This is very important because imagine that if your application, you need several files to be able to be useful or to at least to start. This will basically let you to control that behavior. So let's see with a more specific example. So we define 3 variables here. One, as I said before, the cache version. So we are having the version 1 of this service worker. And then I specify 2 arrays. In one array, I'm specifying the non-critical assets, in this case, for example, foo.css, and the critical assets, index.html, as well as the client bundle. Then I listen to the install event, and in the callback, I say event.waitUntil. So this waitUntil is calling the cache assets. So a cache assets is a promise that we will see right away. So what we are going to do first is basically we are going to open a cache object, and we are calling this function called cache no critical assets, and we are returning the cache critical assets. And you may wonder, okay, I'm a little bit confused. What all does it mean? So the main idea is basically you define a promise where opens the cache as well as cache different resources, either the non-critical ones as well as the critical ones. As you may see, the most important part is this return. Since it's a promise, if we are not able to download the critical assets, like let's say that the cache critical assets function fails, it's gone. The promise will be rejected and the event.waitUntil will stop and the installation will not keep going forward. Again, something that is really useful is to check the cache resources. as I mentioned before. 7.3, removing all cache resources. So yeah, don't forget to clear your cache. That's really, really important. So there are different strategies. So that's something that I would suggest to research and to see how to implement those. But the typical use case is calling the caches.delete. And basically you will need to make sure, like, oh, I have a new version of the service worker. Let's say I have the version 2 of the service worker. Just make sure that you delete the V1 resources because you're no longer need them. So that's also important to clear the resources. Otherwise, you will keep increasing the size of the stuff that you're caching on the browser. 7.4. So this is a very cool strategy, which is I want to fetch the image, but if for whatever reason I cannot retrieve the image, let's say I'm offline, for example, I will return a placeholder. And by placeholder, I mean, if you are on Facebook and somebody doesn't have an avatar, they will see, like the gray silhouette. Or if you are in Twitter, historically, they used to have the egg. So this is what I call by a placeholder. So I'm in the application, I'm online, I'm able to download and see the resources. Now I go offline and boom, I show a placeholder. So this is the strategy that we will cover as of now. How to do that? Let's see. So the first thing is we will listen to the fetch events again, and we will get the event object. What we are gonna basically do here is if the request that the user is performing is an image, so it's the type of image, I want a response with this function that we are going to see right now. So this is kind of like the high-level overview. I'm listening to all the requests that the user is performing. If there is an image, I will do something with that request. What we are going to do in the next slide. So first, I'm defining a placeholder image. In this case, well, it should be a route that points to your application. In this case, images/placeholder.jpj. And in this function, fetch image or placeholder, the first thing that we are going to call, we are going to use is the fetch. So we are using the well-known API to get a request. So into the fetch, we're passing the request from the event. If the promise is successful, I mean, if we are able to fetch the request, we will basically check that there's no error. So if there is an error, we will throw an exception. So we will go to the catch block. But if everything is fine, we will just return the response. In this case, the image. If there is an error, we will return the cache image. So what we are calling here is caches.match. It will tell the cache, hey cache, do you have this placeholder cache image? If it has the cache image, if it has the placeholder, it will return. That's what the match method means. If I have this image cache, I will return it. So that's the first strategy. Now another cool strategy is the network request with cache backup. The idea here is I'm going to perform the network request, meaning anytime that the user wants that image, I'm going to call a server to see if I can get the image. If for whatever reason I'm not able to fetch, either the user is offline or there is an error with the server itself, I'm going to do something else. So let's see the example. Previously, we have cached those images when the user was online, and now we go offline. If we refresh, what it's going to do, the application is first is going to call the server. It will say, hey, server, do you have this image? If the server is not able to respond, it will return one of the cache images that we already have. So again, this is the same example. We're just intercepting all the fetch requests. And what is really interesting is the second slide, which is how to do this strategy. So first, we will call again fetch. Oops, sorry, it's showing all the code. But basically, in the first piece of the promise, if we are able to fetch something, we are going to basically say, I want to open the cache. As you can see, caches.open. And then if I'm able to open the cache, I want to put this resource into the cache. So next time that the user goes offline and the user tries to fetch this request, it's going to be cached in the browser. Let's see the cache statement. So the first thing that we're going to do is, again, caches.match. If for whatever reason previously we have cached that image that the user is requesting, I want you to return that image. Otherwise, I want you to return the placeholder as we see before. So as you can see, it's a bunch of like a game on how do we play with these ideas. But as you can see, it's really powerful, all of these strategies, because it allows you to first say, if the user is connected, I want you to get the fresh data from the server. Otherwise, I want you to return a cache resource. And if for whatever reason that resource is not available, I want you to return a placeholder. So you can see it's kind of like a 3-level questions. If server is available, I want to return that image. If server is not available, I want to try to return a cache image. And if I don't have that cache image, I want you to return the placeholder. So yeah, this is the secret sauce, as I explained before. Yeah, we're about to finish. So further reading here, well, kind of. Further reading is workbooks. So most of the caching stuff is kind of tedious. So Google released this library that is really helpful and already abstract you from many stuff. So it kind of helped you to deal with all the cache resources. Since we only have 1 hour, of course, we couldn't cover all the topics, but this application that we built today has more stuff on it. It's using more stuff. So I want you to give some ideas and some concepts that later on you can research on your own. So the first thing is about local notifications. So if you see this application, anytime that I click there, I'm activating a new notification. So it's really cool if you, for example, are implementing an application, a video game, or you're implementing WhatsApp, etc. So you can use all of these techniques to basically show something to the user when some events happen. Then another really cool API is the Payments API. So it's basically offering browser native payments checkout. I click on the RSVP link, and boom, that opens a payment checkout flow. And this is native and is really interesting. I'm really excited about this API anyways. And then there are other advanced topics that we didn't cover today that I strongly you to take a look and to play around with them. The first thing is the web push notifications. Similar as when you are using a native application that you get a push notification from people, you can use that as well with web apps. Then the second one is the app shell model and also the REPL pattern. They are basically patterns on how do you structure your application in a way that it's more performing, as well as allows to the user to improve the first time to interact with the application. Then we have the background sync and the IndexedDB. So in the case of the IndexedDB, it's a mechanism to have some sort of like a database, but in the client side. Background sync, what allows you is, what happens if I don't have right now internet connection, but the user keeps doing stuff? What happens if, for example, I'm Gmail and the user is trying to type a message, but there's no internet as of now? What you typically do is, no problem, I will just put this message as pending to send, and when the user internet connection gets back, I will send the message. So that's what the background sync allows you. As you can see, all of these techniques are really powerful and brings your web applications full of functionalities. So this is the Q&A time. It's really cool because we have covered all the topics in 1 hour, which is really great. I don't know, guys, if you have any question, I would say we can have 1 or 2 questions and then jump over onto the next step, and you can ask me through email or through Twitter. Is there any questions, Fran?
Yes, there are a couple of questions right now. First one is that if this video will be published. Yes, it will be. I like to say, I always like how you can reply in English. Yes, it will be. And we always ask the speakers to share their slides with us so we can publish also in the same tweet.
Yeah. I will upload. I put a slide later on, but I will upload the slides right away, the talk, and they are going to be available on my Twitter as well. So you can just read and let me know your thoughts.
Yeah, we suggest to follow Jorge's Twitter. There's a super previous question from Marianne Jurado, which I will ask you to clarify a little bit, because we mentioned before by PP about the, I thought it was PP or Lipstick, about the GPS, how you can access the GPS through the API and the PWA. So probably she's asking something similar about the camera. How can you access to the camera if as a user, with the PWA, you can access the camera? How easy it should be?
So I feel like that's not something that is covered in the PWA. Like, there is already functionalities in the browser that allows you to access the camera. So there is not something in the PWA world about how to access the camera. So for example, I don't know if you can see my screen, but simply by putting the HTML tag about input, type file, accept image, if you are, for example, in a mobile application, that will like show a drop-down that will allow you to take a photo library, iCloud. So there is like already some native APIs from the browser that allows you to interact with the camera, as well as with the GPS. I guess like most of you, when you have access, for example, Google Maps, you see the typical prompt saying, do you want to grant access to the GPS of this user? And if so, like they will share the location. It's the same story with the image. Like there are already like native functionalities in the browser that allows you to open the camera. So there's not something related to the PWA in that sense. Okay,
next question from another time from PP. Thanks for asking so many questions and being so active in this. Jorge, could you suggest me a good online course on PWA?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if I put it in the resources tab, but basically one from Front-End Masters is really great. Then I know like in Udemy, there are some other online courses that are really great. And I also strongly recommend you to check the official Google videos about progressive web applications, because they have basically built a whole course about PWAs. So if you can text me on Twitter asking me for these links, I will share them with you right away, because especially the Google one is free, so all of you can access, and it's on YouTube available, and it's really amazing. So it covers a lot of the stuff. Otherwise, if you want a longer courses, either Udemy or the Front-End Masters, there are really great courses there.
Okay, Carla mentioned related to this, that is if there's any chance you can publish all the resources that you are mentioning.
Absolutely. Let me type these down so I don't forget. But basically, I'm gonna share all these resources in my Twitter after finishing this talk.
Remember that this is recorded, so that every promise will be recorded and then can be used against you. Okay. Anyways,
this is recorded already. Go to my Twitter, JD Ferreiro, and check the resources.
Perfect. Well, Ariane mentioned, basically clarify and says yes, that's what we were talking about. And I will say probably the last one, so we can finish a little bit. And I think that it will take a little bit more to reply this. Raffinger, he asked, or she asked, can I develop a PWA using other languages like Angular, Ionic, or another one?
Yes, the answer is yes, and it's really great that you asked these questions. So as you see all the source code for this workshop, all the code is written in vanilla JavaScript. there's nothing specific to any particular framework. Like there was nothing specific to React or nothing specific to Angular. So the answer is yes. I can literally copy all this code and put it into an Angular application and will still work as well. So just to finish, I would like to give you some who to follow people, some people in the industry that I feel like they are posting about PWA, or they have like sharing a lot of resources about them. So you can either take the screenshot or later on revisit the slides. Then I always like to have an action plan, like what's next after this workshop. So first thing is you can go to my GitHub for this PWA 101 repo, and I would suggest to initialize the repo in your local machine, play with that, start changing things, start reading the code, and try to understand all the concepts and things that we learned today, but just in a real application and playing with that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is download this presentation or see this presentation online and open some links. So along the slides, I was putting different links. So I would strongly suggest you to open them, to check them out. And the third one, it's basically execute each of the steps that I covered today, like how do I create a service worker? How do I do a cache? How do I do a cache with a placeholder, cache network with a placeholder? How to all the different ideas that I shared with you today, but in your application. Then these are some resources that I find them interesting. Actually, if you see the resource number 6, it's one of the courses that I recommended before in Frontend Master, as well as the resource number 8. It's also the Google course. So I will share them in Twitter right after the presentation, but you can also access them here. Again, you can find the source code of all the project that we covered today in my GitHub profile. I will post the slides on Twitter. I already spoiled them. So I just want to finalize this presentation with a quote, which is, for me, the progressive web applications are the future of mobile apps. So if you're developing web applications, if you're into this world, start learning today, start shipping today. Progressive web applications are a reality. There are many companies using PWAs in production with huge success. So there's no excuses. Start using that. Let me know how it's going. Share your process on Twitter, and I would really love to help if you have any other questions. So thank you very much, Codemotion.
Thanks, Jorge, for all the presentation and your participation here. In any case, I suggest that if you have any questions or any further, you want to have more information about something that Jorge mentioned today, follow him on Twitter, send him an email, or put a hashtag on Twitter asking about it. So thanks everyone for participating. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you, everyone or anyone, in the next webinar from Codemotion. Jorge, thanks a lot. See you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.